To President Trump as a boorish cartoon misogynist, didn't you? Defense attorney Todd Blanch asked. It sounds like something I would say, Cohen responded. A Cheeto-dusted cartoon villain? That also sounds like something I said.
You referred to President Trump as dictator D-bag, didn't you? Cohen says, sounds like something I said.
Damn! Trump is just sitting there while his own lawyer roasts him. Look, I get the defense's argument that you can't trust Michael Cohen because he hates Donald Trump. But to be fair, everyone who's ever worked with Donald Trump hates Donald Trump. At some point, you gotta be like, I think it's Trump.
We also learned what the defense ordered for lunch today. 14 pizzas, 4 cheese, 5 pepperoni, 4 sausage and pepperoni, and 1 chicken, bacon, and ranch. No word yet on what Trump's lawyers ordered.
Okay, good morning and welcome to Morning Joe Willie. It is today officially, I have triple sourced this, Friday.
It's Friday.
Okay?
Yes, we did it.
Friday, May 17th, everybody.
Like
welcome to Morning Joe. Along with Joe Willie and me, we have the host of Way Too Early, White House Bureau Chief at Politico, Jonathan Lamir, and Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and associate editor of the Washington Post, the great Eugene Robinson.
Jonathan Lamir officially deciding he's going to hang his American flag upside down.
No,
because the Red Sox
not.
lost last night.
I did text that to you.
It was actually a neighbor.
No.
That you have raised
You're not.
that you're doing it for what?
Yeah, there are pictures taken. Yes, we will get to it later this morning. But the Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, American flag at his home hung upside down, signal of distress, done in the days after January 6th. It was a symbol of the Stop the Steal movement. It was hung at the Justice's house. He blames his wife.
You know, Willie, blaming the wife thing for people in public eye in trouble, that's going around.
Don't ever do
that. You know, I'm scared of you. I would never do that. But, Willie, this circles back to these people, and I will say these people, these Trumpers, who have spent their entire life attacking people for being insufficiently patriotic, and then they lose, and they just hate America. They hate America. They're constantly going around saying how weak we are. They hate our military. They say how weak our military is when it's the strongest in the world. They hate our economy. They claim the president of the United States is a socialist. The Dow yesterday made all of these people a lot richer, breaking 40,000 for the first time, despite Donald Trump's lies that it would collapse if Joe Biden was president of the United States. They hate this country. They attack this country. The only time they love it is when their person is in office. And I've just got to say, and we've got a lot of legal, brilliant minds around this table, so they can speak to this later if they want to. I will tell you, growing up, one of my friends' fathers was a federal judge. I had no idea until I got older whether he was Republican or Democrat. And that was the case in Northwest Florida, a very conservative place. The federal judges kept themselves beyond reproach. They never talked politics, ever, in the privacy of their homes. If you ask them opinion, they would just say, not my job, right? I'm a judge. They actually took their oath seriously. And for a Supreme Court justice, and I will say my opinion only, but the guy most likely to have had something to do with the leaking of the Dobbs decision. Leaking it to the Wall Street Journal, or somebody connected to him leaking it to the Wall Street Journal because he wanted to keep Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett frozen in place. I think history will show that. But that aside, for a guy who is a Supreme Court justice that let that happen at his own home in one of the most fraught times in American history since the Civil War, it's just sad. And it shows how little respect he has for the institution. It shows how little respect he has for the law. It really does. It's disgusting. It's just disgusting.
Willie.
And by the way, we can't overstate the timing of this, which is January 17th, 2021. Think about where we were as a country, still completely shaken by what had happened on January 6th. And a sitting Supreme Court justice has a flag flying upside down at his home that is a symbol of solidarity, as John said, with the Stop the Steal movement. We should explain a little bit here. The New York Times is reporting that a photo of an American flag outside the home of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito has now been made public. The flag flown upside down. As the Times notes, the inverted flag has become a symbol of Trump supporters who claim, again, without evidence, that the 2020 election was stolen. Reading from the piece now, quote, the upside-down flag was aloft on January 17th, 2021, the images showed. President Donald J. Trump's supporters, including some brandishing the same symbol, had rioted at the Capitol a little over a week before. Mr. Biden's inauguration was 3 days away. Alarmed neighbors snapped photographs, some of which were recently obtained by the New York Times. While the flag was up, the court was still contending with whether to hear a 2020 election case, with Justice Alito on the losing end of that decision. In coming weeks, the justices will rule on two climactic cases involving the storming of the Capitol on January 6, including whether Mr. Trump has immunity for his actions. Their decisions will shape how accountable he can be held for trying to overturn the last presidential election and his chances for re-election in the upcoming one. I had no involvement whatsoever in the flying of the flag, Justice Alito said in an emailed statement to the Times. It was briefly placed by Mrs. Alito in response to a neighbor's use of objectionable and personally insulting language on yard signs, Joe.
Wait. So you're going to hate on America because of something a neighbor did?
You're going to blame your wife?
Right. And blame your
make
wife?
Up that excuse?
What is this? What is this?
My wife was mad at a neighbor.
Blaming wives. Anybody care to jump in here?
But I want to know what person, let alone woman, wife, would do that in response to a problem with a neighbor.
Eugene, a neighbor upsets me. Comes out, makes fun of me because the Rays beat the Red Sox last night, and the Red Sox really suck. Okay. And so I'm mad. Okay. I'm not going to hang my flag upside down. None of this. This is as dumb as what I heard about the Dobbs leak. Okay. Nobody believes him.
No, nobody believes him, and there's no reason to believe him. And he says briefly, you know, that Times story had neighbors suggesting that briefly meant for a period of days. This flag was flying upside down at Justice Alito's house, and the idea that, you know, a yard sign that says something rude, and apparently it said something rude about President Trump, is enough for a Supreme Court justice who was supposed to be non-political, was supposed to be, you know, less political than Caesar's wife, would do this, and I'll just say do this, not allow his wife to go out and run up the flagpole, but would do this, and now, of course, as Alito always does, try to sort of brazen his way through it. I mean, I'll just say it. I have thought for a long time that Alito is the worst justice. He is one of the worst justices that we have seen on the Supreme Court since the days of, you know, Roger Taney and the other justices that enabled decades of Jim Crow. I mean, he's intellectual. His opinions have always struck me as intellectually dishonest, clearly tailored to come out to a predetermined result. He's, you know, and now this. It's just stunning to me. Stunning.
And it's not just that it was a few days after January 6th. While that flag was flying upside down, the court was still contending as to whether or not to hear a 2020 election case. And let's also remember, of course, Ginny Thomas, the wife of Clarence Thomas, part of the same Stop the Steal movement. So now you have two justices potentially compromised on this issue as we head into another election that could very well end up before the court again.
Right, and Chuck, I really, ideology is irrelevant. Again, I've known progressive federal judges. I've known very conservative federal judges. They hold themselves beyond reproach. This is really, again, for the time, It's just unbelievable.
So something you said earlier, Joe, really resonated with me. You grew up in the Florida Panhandle, and a friend's father was a federal judge.
Right.
And you had no idea, none, what his politics were. So I spent my professional life in federal court around federal judges. I have never seen or heard anything that would suggest to me that ideology played a role in their decisions. Some of the judges were great, some were good, some were mediocre. So they got some stuff right, they got some stuff wrong, but I've never seen politics infect their work. And by the way, I can extend that a little bit further. It was true of the federal prosecutors with whom I worked. We never had a political discussion in 2 decades in our office. Ever.
Ever.
Same with the federal agents.
Chuck, I want you to underline that fact, because people have to understand that despite what they see from, I will just say this, from Justice Thomas and Justice Alito, people take their oaths seriously. Conservatives, moderates, progressives, they see themselves as officers of the court, and damn it, they held this country together after January the 6th.
And I have no doubt that among my colleagues were liberals, moderates, progressives, conservatives, all stripes. But we never discussed it. In fact, I remember once, Joe, walking through our office parking lot and seeing a bumper sticker on someone's car, which startled me because it was a political bumper sticker. I had never seen that ever before. It turned out that that particular federal prosecutor had borrowed his spouse's car because his was in the shop. And that was the only time I even saw a bumper sticker in our parking lot expressing a political view. It was so unusual that I noticed it.
Yeah.
Also with us, we have former litigator and MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. How are you holding up covering this trial? All day, every day. And MSNBC legal analyst Danny Savalos, because we also have to talk about the criminal hush money trial with former President Donald Trump, which we'll get to now. It potentially could wrap up next week. We'll find out from the experts here. The prosecution's star witness, Michael Cohen, is set to return to the stand on Monday after Trump's legal team tried to hammer away at his credibility yesterday. Court is in recess today, so the former president can attend his son Barron's high school graduation this morning. Lead defense attorney Todd Blanch says Cohen's questioning will likely wrap up on Monday. The prosecution has said it does not plan to call any additional witnesses, and the defense says it may not call any either. That means closing arguments could begin as early as Tuesday, clearing the way for jury deliberations by the end of next week. But hold on a second, Willie, Lisa, am I wrong about that? You shook your head.
No, I was talking to someone in the control room.
Oh, good. Okay.
I'm lifting the curtain. I'm sorry.
You can lift it. That's fine. And go ahead and communicate. I just wouldn't make sure the information was right. Willie, so we're looking now just at what happened yesterday.
And another day of cross-examination of Michael Cohen yesterday. He testified he spoke directly to former President Trump on the phone about the payments to Stormy Daniels. Cohen asserted he contacted Trump through Trump's bodyguard, Keith Schiller, on October 24th, 2016, about the hush money payments. It's about 2 weeks before Election Day. Defense attorney Todd Blanch pressed Cohen about phone records showing he texted Schiller that day, in which Cohen asked how to handle a teenager who was prank calling him. Cohen responded saying he did not remember that message. Blanch said, quote, "Do you recall texting Keith Schiller at 7:48 p.m.? Who can I speak to regarding harassing calls to myself in office? The dope forgot to block his call on one of them. You don't recall that?" Cohen responded, "It sounds right, yes." Blanch then noted a return text to Cohen where Schiller simply says, "Call me." Blanch then pointed out Cohen called Schiller immediately after for a conversation that lasted only about a minute and a half. Blanch accused Cohen of lying, suggesting he did not speak to Trump during that call about Stormy Daniels as he had testified. Cohen, however, insisted both topics were covered despite the short length of the call. The defense also attempted to paint Cohen as having a vendetta against Trump. Here's a portion of his podcast that was played in court.
I truly hope that this man ends up in prison. It won't bring back the year that I lost or the damage done to my family. But revenge, I don't believe I want this man to go down and rot inside for what he did to me and my family.
Okay, Lisa, so you were down at the courthouse again yesterday. We can talk about that podcast moment in just a second, but let's go back to, because it was a little confusing maybe as you listened through it. What was Todd Blanch, what was the Trump defense team getting at with that text and phone call between Michael Cohen and the bodyguard Keith Schiller?
Well, let's talk about, there was a narrow implication and then a much broader one, Willie, that they were trying to draw. The first thing they were trying to say is that Cohen's testimony about the phone call on October 24th between him and Keith Schiller, which he testified was really a call to Trump about the Stormy Daniels settlement, wasn't true. They presented him with text messages and phone call records that hadn't been part of his direct examination. And the insinuation was, you manufactured this. When you said you talked to Keith Schiller in order to talk to Donald Trump about finalizing the Stormy Daniels settlement, that didn't really happen, did it? You had a minute 30-second long phone call with him, and juxtaposed with these texts about the 14-year-old who was prank calling you at the time. It's pretty clear that you called Keith Schiller to complain about that, to get Secret Service involved, to get security involved in these harassing phone calls. It had nothing to do with Stormy Daniels. That may or may not be true. It is also true that 2 days later, on the 26th, there is indisputably calls between Michael Cohen and Donald Trump. And I expect on redirect that we'll hear a lot from the prosecution about that Michael Cohen certainly notified Donald Trump and spoke with him for some longer period of time as he was finalizing it. But the broader implication that Todd Blanch was trying to draw is, if you can't trust Michael Cohen about this phone call, can you really trust any of his testimony about the conversations that he had with Donald Trump at the time? After all, this was nearly 8 years ago. And isn't it really the case that Michael Cohen's recollection is not organic, but is rather the construction of multiple prep sessions upon prep sessions with prosecutors from the Manhattan DA's office who have constructed a memory in Michael Cohen that didn't organically exist about a conversation that never happened, and others as well?
You know, Danny, I have expressed at times skepticism about this case even being brought. I will say, though, yesterday, when commentators were talking about how this was like some Perry Mason moment, I just laughed and said, no, it's not. A juror is not going to go, oh, my God, 8 years ago, a minute and a half conversation, da-da-da. Well, I mean, it seems to me the much bigger problem is the podcast where he says, I want this guy to get down. I mean, the prosecution's going to be able to clean this up on redirect, aren't they?
I agree, but I think you and I are in the minority. The vibe I've been getting is that a lot of folks feel like this was that kind of Perry Mason moment. And to that I say, when it comes to cooperating witness types like Cohen, and Cohen, if we take a step back, isn't even close to the worst kind of cooperating witness you normally have on the stand. Right. These are hardened criminals normally. Right. This is not Cohen. So the prosecution knows that he's going to get dinged on things, especially because a lot of these allegations happened 8 years ago. And juries will forgive memory lapses from that long ago. So I wasn't in the courtroom, but from what I could see, I think this is something that one of two things will happen. Either the prosecution will choose to clean it up on redirect, or, Joe, they may not even think it's that big a deal. Yeah. They may go for the better moment, which is to stand up and say, we're good. We have no further questions for this witness. I just didn't think it was that damaging because the prosecution is going to concede, essentially, and they have throughout the case, Cohen's flaky. Cohen's a guy that, you know, isn't the most reliable person, but he's believable on these issues. And, you know, I've been guilty of this before myself in cases where you find a factual inconsistency and you really hammer it and you think it's going to be that Perry Mason moment. But if you hammer it too much, it looks a little petty to the jury. Right. So it's really, it's hard to say what the jurors are thinking. It just didn't strike me as something that was fatal to the prosecution. Everybody knew that Cohen was going to get hit with his inconsistencies on cross-examination. I don't think it came to, as a surprise to the prosecution. And I don't even think even the defense thinks that they completely dunked on the state's case.
So, Chuck, if you were in this, how would you handle this moment with Cohen? What would be the plan? And once Cohen's done, we may be out of witnesses unless Donald Trump is called to the stand.
That's right. So first, preliminarily, I agree with Joe and Danny. Perry Mason moments happen on Perry Mason.
Exactly.
They don't tend to happen in courtrooms. It would be extraordinarily rare. Second, I also agree with Danny that either the government cleans it up or ignores it. I mean, cross-examination of Mr. Cohen lasted, what, 17 and a half years? And at the end of that, this is what we're left with, that there was a discrepancy about a phone call 8 years ago. Great. He's probably wrong, but was he intentionally wrong? If he was intentionally wrong, that's a problem.
And talk about jurors for a second. That when the jury goes back, they're not going to go, oh, my God, there's a minute-and-a-half phone call. He had texted him the night before about one topic. They're going to go, it was eight and a half years ago. They could have talked about two things in passing. I can talk about a lot of things in a minute and a half.
So if it was if it was unintentionally wrong, Joe, which is, I would imagine, the view that the jurors would take of this, and even if the government doesn't clean it up, I think it's just, it's a shooting star. It's water under the bridge. Choose your analogy. Choose your metaphor.
Shooting star, exactly.
Exactly. Spilt milk.
A flaming supernova. Go, keep going. Spilt milk's a good one, too.
Yeah.
Let's write these down.
We have 4 hours.
Okay, we do have 4 hours.
But a pencil must be lead.
I want to know what's next.
Go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, I have no idea what I'm talking about now, but that's typically true. But at the end of the day, I think that in a long cross-examination, Jonathan, it's not going to matter that much. The jury looks at it holistically. In the main, can we trust this guy? In the main, is he corroborated by other documents and witnesses and evidence? In the main, even if he got a few things wrong, is he credible? That's the jury's determination, but I don't think this incident undermines that.
All right, so Lisa, looking ahead, a day off today for Barron's graduation. But court next Wednesday, what are we expecting here? What can we know to expect?
So court on Monday.
Court on Monday.
And I think Todd Blanche will wrap up with Michael Cohen fairly quickly, and then we will see how much redirect the prosecutions have of Michael Cohen and whether they go into this phone call or spend more time on larger issues.
Should they go into the phone call?
I think they should, because it affects them as well. I think one of the problems with the phone call, I'm sort of in between Danny, Chuck, and you, Joe, and the people whose hair is on fire here. I think one of the problems with the phone call is it also suggests the sloppiness of the DA's case, because Cohen said on the stand, I've never seen this phone call. In all the prep sessions that I had for the last 8 years, I've never thought about these phone calls or these texts. That means someone in the prosecutor's office likely missed them in their prep sessions. And remember, they're getting call records and texts from a variety of different sources. They already brought in people from AT&T and Verizon and the like. They missed this. And then the question becomes, if they missed this, what else might they have missed? And so there is a potential larger issue there. If I were them, I would clean it up. But, different people make different strategic choices, and I also agree that the larger question is, do you believe this guy, given the propensity of other actual lies that he's told when this just could have been a misunderstanding?
And I said court on Wednesday because I thought there was a proposal to actually...
There was.
Okay, did that happen?
It didn't, because some of the jurors came back and said they weren't available on Wednesday.
Okay.
So on Monday, after they're finished, presumably when they finish, the prosecution rests their case, then the defense has their choice to make, whether they will present a case of their own. I will predict, I'm curious what Chuck and Danny think, that the defense will not present any case at all, but they will leave that issue dangling over the weekend, leave prosecutors in suspense so that they divert some of their own efforts. Then we'll see a charging conference about what the jury instructions will look like. Tuesday morning, we'll start to see, I would expect, summations. The jury will be instructed, and then as early as Thursday, they can start their deliberations.
Danny?
Seem right?
Sounds about right.
Sounds about right.
I think it's a pretty good chance that the defense calls no witnesses at all and puts on no case. I mean, I tend to lean towards not calling witnesses if I don't have to. I'm very risk averse, and if you are risk averse, that's usually the approach, unless there's just something you absolutely need from a witness. And then you think, well, are they going to call one or two? Well, that's a strange choice, because if you call one witness, you've sort of put on a case, and it shows the jury, well, you put something on, but you only had one witness. I think if it's that minimal, then maybe it's better to just say, look, they haven't proven their case, stand on beyond a reasonable doubt, the presumption of innocence, the burden of proof, pound the podium. You didn't call any witnesses for your alternate theory, but it seems more and more that their theory is just going to be they didn't prove the elements they needed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
And Chuck?
That sounds about right to me, too. I mean, statistically, it would be unusual, very unusual, to put the defendant on the stand, extremely rare. And more typically, the defense will not mount a case, nor do they have to, right? The burden's on the prosecution. It's always on the prosecution. It never shifts from the prosecution. And to the extent that they had certain theories about the weaknesses of the prosecution's case, Joe, they've tried to adduce that through cross-examination. That's the more typical route.
Right.
Okay, former U.S. Attorney Chuck Rosenberg, MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, and MSNBC legal analyst Danny Savalos. Thank you all very much. A-team, first thing in the morning.
Just summing this up, spilt milk, water under the bridge, shooting star.
Okay.
What we have?
Lead a horse to water.
Lead a horse to water, lead, pencil, whatever.
Yeah. All right, still ahead on Morning Joe. Okay. The leaders of Russia and China agreed to strengthen military and diplomatic ties. What that could mean for Ukraine and also NATO amid Moscow's ongoing invasion. We'll go to Beijing for the very latest. We're back in 90 seconds.
And deepening the comprehensive strategic partnership, as they're calling it, between their countries as both leaders face rising tensions with the West. The move comes as Putin wages a new offensive in Ukraine. Earlier today, Putin met with the Chinese vice president, where he expressed that he's grateful for China's initiatives to resolve the war in Ukraine. Joining us now live from Beijing, NBC News international correspondent Janice Mackey-Frayer. Janice, what more can you tell us about this visit by Putin to Beijing?
Well, this is a key visit for Vladimir Putin, his first foreign trip since securing another 6 years in power, and fitting that he would make it to see his old friend Xi Jinping. China's no-limits partnership with Russia and the close personal relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping are arguably among Putin's most important ties. And the timing of this is significant in that it's coming as Russia is intensifying the war in Ukraine, while at the same time, the U.S. is intensifying pressure on China to do more to stop Russia's war in Ukraine. Russia is pulling closer to China economically at the same time that the U.S. seems to be pulling away. Just earlier this week, imposing stiff tariffs on a number of Chinese goods, including 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. So Putin, in making this trip, is trying to score another win in that he's looking to ensure the economic lifeline that his #1 trading partner has provided. The two men have talked about deepening their cooperation on military, on energy, on financial institutions, Russia's use of China's currency, the renminbi. And then, of course, the subtext to all of this is this shared vision they have of a new global order, a new take on international relations, as they say, which is something on which they are strategically aligned. Willie.
Janice Mackey-Frayer live for us this morning in Beijing. Janice, thanks so much. So, Joe, rolling out the red carpet, China for Vladimir Putin, all the trappings of a state visit, the military, everything you could expect, making a big show of standing side by side with a man who now is in year 3 of his invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, you know, I mean, this is not 1970. Yeah. This would be if actually President Xi met with Gavin Newsom, he would be meeting with somebody that had a larger economy than Vladimir Putin. So what is so striking to me is that Vladimir Putin is willing to be a junior partner in this relationship. It is, and I'm not just saying, it's just the case. He's humiliating himself and basically making himself a vassal of China, which Richard Haas just sort of shook his head like he usually does after every New York Giants game. Let's bring him down. He's the author
newsletter,
also.
Home and Away.
Yeah, exactly. Also detailing the ups and downs of the Giants football season, which is available in Substack. Also, former aide to the George W. Bush White House and State Department, Elise Jordan. Also, former reporter for the Wall Street Journal, Matthew Brzezinski. Thank you all for being with us. So, Richard, we saw in the early 70s, of course, the Soviets, China, and the United States constantly playing off of each other. In this case, you have Vladimir Putin with a battered military and a weakened economy, basically throwing himself into the arms of President Xi and saying, "Save me."
That's not surprising because he doesn't have a whole lot of options, Joe. What's surprising and disappointing is that Xi Jinping has doubled down on his relationship with Vladimir Putin. There were a lot of people a couple of years ago when they first signed their no limits agreement on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, who basically are saying, gee, maybe Xi Jinping regrets this, particularly after things didn't go so well. What we saw the last couple of days is we now see China doubling down.
Is this a reaction, though, to the United States, or doing what I think the United States should do? New York Times highlighted it. We've been talking about it a couple of years ago. Joe Biden strengthening the presence, whether it's in Guam, the Philippines, with Japan spending a lot more on their military, nuclear subs to Australia. The hemming in of China in the East. Do you think this may be a reaction to that?
In part.
I mean, a logical reaction.
Look, China doesn't have allies. Russia is now a strategic partner. The United States, the great comparative advantage is we have Japan and other allies. But I also think it reflects China's assessment that whether it's Joe Biden or Donald Trump, there's very little upside in a relationship with us. Right now, there's almost a competition between the two parties as to who can be tougher on China. Biden never removed Trump's tariffs. He just added new tariffs this week. So I think the Chinese have basically discounted any possibility of a better relationship with us, and they may also see real advantage in the United States being bogged down, increasingly depleted by supplying Ukraine in a war in Europe.
You know, though, Elise, and I'm not saying this because I'm an American, I'm saying this because if you just take a couple of steps back, China needs us a lot more than we need China. Is he really going to trade a good relationship with a Russia that has an economy the size of Texas, or maybe now a little weaker than Texas, instead of the West? You know, again, I always have to remind people of this because the Earth is not flat. We have about a $26 trillion economy. Europe has a $26 trillion economy yearly. China's at 17 trillion. Russia's at 1.4 trillion, roughly. So you're talking about China going, we're gonna side with a 1.4 trillion economy and live in this isolated side of the world and have bad relations with, you know, $50, $60 trillion worth of trade.
I agree with Richard. I think that Xi and China, they've made the calculation that it's not going to get better with the United States, no matter who is in office. Politically, stateside in the U.S., it is such a strong issue to be seen as aggressive towards China. And that's not going to change whether the contender is a Democrat or a Republican. And so you look at what's happening now, and China, it's an advantage if the U.S. dollar gets weaker. It's an advantage if the U.S. is using all of its arms supplying Israel and in Ukraine and is running shortages. It's an advantage to China, anything that happens to the U.S. that weakens our economy and our arms.
Can I say one other thing? I don't think Xi Jinping thinks he has to choose the way you set it up. I think he thinks he can have his cake and eat it. He can strategically associate with Russia, and he thinks, for example, that American business will be so enthusiastic about maintaining access to the Chinese market that I think he figures he's probably okay. And that's why, for example, you always see Xi Jinping courting American business leaders. So I don't think they see quite the trade-off or the opportunity cost that you're
right. It's not a zero-sum game for him.
Exactly.
Right. Hey, Matthew, we've talked often here about the reasons why Russia felt the need to invade Ukraine. In a discussion you and I had offline earlier this week, you had a fascinating insight that if you really step back, it begins to make sense, at least in Putin's mind, why he was so desperate to make Ukraine, to swallow Ukraine up. Talk about that.
Well, I think that that Putin may be looking to have a military solution to what is essentially a demographic problem. Russia has terminal demographics. It is effectively dying, and not even necessarily a slow death. Here, bear with me with some numbers here. In 1991, when the Russian Federation emerged from the husk of the Soviet Union, it had a population of 150 million to our 250 million. Since then, our population has grown to 335 million, while Russia's has fallen to just over 140 million. Worse yet, in the next 20 years, by the Kremlin's own estimates, While the U.S. will be over 400 million, Russia's population will continue falling to around 130 million, and the United Nations thinks it'll go to 115 million.
Why? Well, first of all, why is that? Why is there this demographic time bomb that has blown up? And that does make sense why they desperately need Ukraine. That's number one. And number two, how is this impacting Putin's ability to fight this war?
Well, I mean, the statisticians will tell you that Russia has very low birth rates, it has high immigration rates, and it has high mortality rates. What that doesn't say is, why. And the short answer is Russia is just a very unattractive place to live under Putin, who's been in power for 25 years. And when this next term is done, he'll be in power longer than Stalin, and only Catherine the Great will have ruled Russia longer than Putin. Russia has turned into a thuggish, repressive kleptocracy where the average citizen subsists on $800 a month, while Kremlin cronies have $700 million yachts with full-time crews of 250 people and literally running costs of around $70–80 million a year. The obscene wealth at the top and the incredible poverty at the bottom, coupled with the KGB running rampant, has just made Russia a very unattractive place to live, and people have voted with their feet.
Yeah, and they have voted with their feet, and obviously some of the brightest minds, the tech minds, the very people Putin needs, have left the country. But these numbers, you look at 335 million Americans to 140 million Russians, and that's going to expand to 400 million Americans to 130 million. That is a demographic time bomb that is going off now.
Yeah, and one that Putin is trying to address, perhaps, with this land grab in Ukraine. Yeah. But the long-word trends aren't going to end up in his favor. Richard, speaking of Ukraine, Putin is in Beijing looking for reinforcements. He's not getting lethal aid, but China continues to send supplies that his military can use. NATO, front page story of the New York Times today. NATO allies are inching closer to sending troops into Ukraine to train Ukrainian forces. We know how much President Biden has prized revitalizing the NATO alliance. Its 75th summit will be this summer, held in Washington. But take us to this decision. There's real risk here, too.
It wouldn't be combat troops. We're probably talking about trainers. Right now, the training of Ukraine is taking place in places like Poland, and the idea is just to step it up and to have more people on scene and probably give them a little bit more tactical advice. And I think it's a reflection that the trajectory of the war is moving against Ukraine. What we've seen in the last few months, in part because of the delay in U.S. military aid for several months, and then also because Russia's really geared up. In part because of Chinese help, North Korean, Iranian help, and their own wartime economy, the tide of the battle's turning against Ukraine, not decisively, but the trend is clear. And I think what you're beginning to see are people in NATO saying, what can we do to stem this momentum? And that's why we're going to probably see this step of having trainers inside Ukraine itself. See, one other point, since we're talking about demographics in Russia, I think the demographics in China are even more stark. You're talking about a country of 1.3, 1.4 billion. By the end of the century, we're probably looking at a country with 800 million. Think about the difference here.
And by the way, Matthew brought it up about Russia. You're dead right. I'm so glad you brought up China, too. I've talked to one CEO after another who has told me China's a wreck in every way. Their security forces, the oppression, what he's done over the past 5 years to some of the brightest minds, but they always bring up the demographic time bomb there, too. And they say 20, 30 years from now, they're going to be haunted by this one-child policy.
That also, people are voting with their feet in China, too. If you're a young person who's entrepreneurial, there's no place to go. The only danger of this, and there's a big debate going on amongst foreign policy types, does this lead China to become more assertive or even aggressive? If you have a leadership that can't scratch the itch of nationalism, that by high levels of economic growth, does China ultimately look at Taiwan as their salvation? And it's interesting that Xi Jinping constantly uses the word rejuvenation. The rejuvenation of China is not demographic, it's not economic. The question is whether it comes through foreign policy adventure. And that is the thing that we have to worry about, because as the economy fails, as the demography falls, does China then look for some other out? And that's, so even if you're right, and I think you are, Joe, that China faces enormous headwinds, that doesn't necessarily mean good things for us. It could actually be very tough.
It certainly doesn't mean stability. Look at the guy hunched over in the seat right there, Vladimir Putin. There's a reason he went into Ukraine because he knows, as Matthew said, his country's dying. And so what happens when China starts sensing the same thing?
And what's also, well, it's not just because country's dying, that he needed something positive to show. This is his legacy. Right. And I think for both, the parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan are quite interesting. In both cases, Putin and Xi see them as organically part of the country.
Right.
And that's another reason that China is so supportive of Putin. They don't mind this precedent.
Yeah, and Willie, of course, in the middle of all of this, India, which of course is absolutely fascinating, a battle for again, where Modi decides to go.
Yeah, I mean, they're playing a role in all this that doesn't get as much publicity as it probably should. Let's bring in a member of the Ukrainian parliament, Alexandra Ustinova. She's chairwoman of the country's Commission on Arms Control. Ms. Ustinova, thanks for being with us this morning. I want to talk to you about why you're in Washington this week, but first, just get your reaction to the images we've been seeing, the discussion we're having about Vladimir Putin being welcomed with open arms, the red carpet rolled out by Xi Jinping and China. What does that signal to you from where you sit?
Well, unfortunately, Ukraine has been saying for quite a while that China is just pretending to stand aside this war. So far, we've seen that the North Koreans and the Iranians had been supporting Russia with weapons directly. China has been supporting them economically and using the dual use. They're sending tons of the stuff to Russia that actually can be teared apart, and the chips can be used later for the bombs, for the missiles, and for the drones that are hitting Ukrainian cities and civilians every day. So unfortunately, this is very sad what we're watching right now, because this is the fight between the democratic countries, the free world, and the autocracies. And China is watching closely what's going to happen in Ukraine, whether the Western world is going to support Ukraine enough to win, and then decide whether they're going to go after Taiwan or not. So we can see that, unfortunately, they're uniting and they're supporting each other much faster than the allies sometimes are united to support Ukraine.
So you are in Washington, a town, a city, a capital, and a body that took far too long to get Ukraine its much-needed aid, but it did come last month, $60 billion worth of it on its way, making its way soon to the battlefield where it's desperately needed. What do you expect that to do? What difference will that make, and what more do you need?
So first,